Hey, welcome back, or welcome, and good morning, good day, and good afternoon, depending on your time zone. This is the COVID-19 remote working and the business case for ECM presentation, presented by Bill Safety. Our sponsor is nChoice. nChoice is an enterprise content management solutions company that helps customers improve their business processes and protect their critical information by offering software solutions and support that accelerate the achievement of business efficiencies and competitiveness. The company is recognized industry-wide for its innovative solutions for IBM, FileNet, IBM Content Manager, On Demand, and OpenText Documentum. Our speaker has a long and fantastic career in records information management. Bill Safety is a records management consultant, researcher, author. He's based in New York City. And with no further ado, I will turn it over to Bill to pick up from there.
So this presentation, as the title implies, is going to deal with the pandemic, its impact on remote working, and the impact of all of that on the business case for enterprise content management. So this is more or less the spoken version of a paper that I wrote back in July of 2020. And that paper is posted at my website, www.safety.com. So anybody that wants the written out version can get it there. Okay, so we're ready to go. Thanks.
So this presentation is three groups. The first is records managers and other information professionals in organizations that are considering an ECM implementation. Don't have one now, but are seriously looking at one and looking for ways to cost justify it. The second is organizations, information professionals in organizations that currently have an ECM implementation that they acquired for a specific purpose, but it's not fully deployed at the enterprise level and would like some ideas about how they could benefit from an enterprise-wide implementation. And the third group is companies that sell ECM solutions that are looking for opportunities to present their products in a way that customers will consider them cost justifiable. Everything that we're going to say here is targeted at enterprise content management products, but many of the ideas are also relevant for allied products. For example, records management application software, so-called RMA software, that's focused on retention of electronic records, and digital asset management systems that focus on audiovisual content as opposed to textual content. I want to start off by summarizing the key points from the presentation. There are four of them. First, with offices empty or underutilized, many organizations are reevaluating their physical workplaces and their need for office space. It's an important theme in records management work. Efficient use of office space brought records management to prominence as a professional discipline in the 1950s, and this could be viewed as a continuation of that theme, although at a much more pervasive and complete level, as we'll see. And second point is, if remote working continues, organizations will be able to dispose of unneeded office space or avoid the cost of reconfiguring it to comply with public health measures. And the third point, for this to happen, remote workers must have reliable online access to documents. We're going to make this point more fully as we go along, but it's pretty certain that if people are going to work at home or in other places, other remote locations, they must have the same level of access to documents as they would have in the office workplace. And the fourth point is that an ECM implementation can be viewed as an enabling technology for remote working. It provides reliable online access to documents, and it could constitute a cost-effective investment for organizations that want to reduce their office footprints. We're going to develop all of these ideas in the next couple of slides. So here an outline of the topics that we're going to discuss. First, we're going to do a relevance assessment to see or to help you to determine whether or to what extent this is even relevant for you. Then we'll talk about remote working concepts, get some definitions, a little bit about historical background and the motivation for remote working. Then we'll talk about the problem of documents and the managing documents and in a remote working environment and the limitations of shared drives for that purpose. Then we'll discuss the problem of office space and the ECM alternative to in-office working. And then finally, at the end of the session, we'll talk about some assumptions that on which the discussion is based, and some caveats that you need to keep in mind. Here's some questions that you need to ask in order to determine whether and to what extent the things that we're going to talk about are even relevant for your organization. First, how much longer will the COVID pandemic last? We're going to talk about ECM as a solution for remote working, but if you don't think that remote working is going to last much longer, or that it is too late to be putting some of these ideas into effect, then this is the things we're talking about are just not for you. So some things you need to consider is whether herd immunity or evolution of the virus to become less deadly will occur within a reasonable time frame. So this is a question that's much in the news. It's none too clear about when herd immunity will be attained. Herd immunity provides indirect protection from infection and presumably will slow or stop the spread of the coronavirus. This depends on a combination of vaccination and having a sufficient number of people recover from infection to have some degree of immunity. So the thinking is that this may require 70 to 85% of the population to have immunity at some level. And public health experts project that this might be reached or attained in, say, late 2021 in the United States, but not before maybe 2024 globally, depending on the pace of vaccination. We hear other numbers for this, but these numbers appear to be relatively mainstream projections. So it appears that this will be ongoing in the US at least through the end of the year. And if you have operations in other countries, depending on where you are, much longer. It's thought that COVID-19 is not going to disappear completely. There's only ever been one pathogen that's been completely eradicated by vaccination, smallpox. So it's likely that COVID will persist at some level as an endemic disease, but it's unlikely to excessively disrupt public life or business operations. The second question relates to the likelihood of recurrence of a public health emergency at this level of severity. So the question is this a once in a 100-year event, like a bout of bad weather or tremendously destructive weather, or is it one of a series of public health emergencies of varying severity that we need to be concerned about and that may require some emergency response in the not too distant future? Well, the past gives us, I suppose, some help with this in understanding this. This is not the only pandemic of the 20th century. The obvious comparison is with the Spanish flu, H1N1 influenza from 1918 to 1920, which made a couple of reappearances later in the 20th century, most notably as the swine flu from 2009 to 2010. And the other incidents would include Asian flu, H2N2 influenza from 57 to 1958, the Hong Kong flu from an H3N2 influenza from 1968 to 1970, and then the Russian flu in 1977, which was a reoccurrence of a much more deadly illness from 1889 to 1890. All of these things taken together suggest that we could expect some further public health emergencies, and that's generally the thinking of scientists and public health authorities. The next question is, when will offices reopen? Well, some of them are open now, but reports from commercial property management companies suggest that maybe 10 to 15% of office employees in New York City have returned to the office on any given day. And then a related question, will remote working cease when offices reopen? Well, as discussed in the next slides, there are other motives for remote working that predate the pandemic. It's possible, maybe likely, that some offices will not reopen as they were before the pandemic. And even if offices do reopen, it seems likely that some employees will continue to work remotely some of the time. And of course, there are other types of emergencies that could require a remote working. Severe weather is the obvious example. This presentation adopts a broad definition of remote working to encompass any work that is performed at a location other than an employer's office. So depending on the circumstances of employment, remote working might be permanent or a temporary arrangement. Remote working might be partial or complete. Some remote workers might be expected to come to an employer's office occasionally or regularly for meetings, for other purposes. Working at home during the ongoing public health emergency is the most frequently cited example of remote working, but working at home also includes self-employed individuals who operate home-based businesses, employees who bring work home to complete after office hours. In non-industrialized countries, employees who do piecework in their homes are an important component of the workforce. And then there are other types of remote working that are sometimes collectively described as third place working, where the third place is any place other than your home or the employer's office. So examples of these include working at a branch location or field office, working at a commercial co-working site like WeWork or a temporary rental space that your employer may have acquired, working while traveling, working at customer locations, and working in the field for data collection, research, inspection. This is a case with a range of jobs ranging from, say, insurance adjusters to archaeologists. While the pandemic has focused attention on working from home, remote working is not a new idea. The possibility of telecommuting or teleworking has been widely discussed for decades. But early enthusiasts for remote working were generally overly optimistic about the time frame for its adoption. Some futurists predicted that perhaps half of the white-collar workforce would be able to work from home by the late 1970s, but few did. In the 1980 census, less than 2.5% of workers reported their homes as their primary place of employment, and most of those were home-based businesses. In the early 1990s, management guru Peter Drucker characterized commuting to office work as obsolete, but the vast majority of employees were still doing it a decade later. A 2002 survey found that 17% of full-time employees in the United States were teleworking at least part of the time, but 50% of the survey respondents indicated an interest in a permanent remote working arrangement. Several recent surveys suggest that at least half of employees in industrialized countries are able to work from home successfully. In the 1970s and 1980s, public policy analysts, urban planners, and transportation engineers viewed telecommuting as a way to reduce energy consumption, traffic congestion, and air pollution. And in a 1990 statement, President George H.W. Bush endorsed telecommuting as an aspect of national transportation policy. More recently, scientists, environmental activists, and others concerned about the environment have cited the sustainability benefits of remote working. In particular, they note that a home-based workplace has a much smaller carbon footprint than an office. Occupational psychologists and social scientists have generally praised remote working as a way for employees to attain greater job satisfaction and achieve a reasonable work-life balance. And for human resources specialists, remote working offers the ability to attract and keep qualified workers that have dependent care responsibilities, mobility impairments, inability or reluctance to relocate, and most recently, we've heard advocates of remote working talking about the issues of gender equality and the ability of remote work arrangements to return women to the workforce. Surveys indicate that many employees like the savings in time and commuting costs while they are working at home. And a Gallup survey of US remote workers found that half of the respondents preferred to continue working at home indefinitely when the pandemic ends. Recognizing this, some organizations are allowing their employees to continue working from home for a year or longer if they care to do so. And more recently, some organizations that have announced that their employees will return to the office in the spring have postponed that until the end of the summer or the fall. And then in anticipation of a permanent remote working arrangement, some employees in high-priced areas have relocated to other states, making it unlikely that they intend to return when offices do reopen. From the start, advocates of remote working understood that people working away from the office needed convenient access to information in order to do their jobs. Online access to computer databases partially filled that need, but the rapid progress of office automation in the 1980s and 1990s had little impact on filing cabinets filled with paper records. Remote workers still had to go to offices from time to time to consult or make copies of transaction documents, of customer records, case files, contract files, technical specifications, project records. Even in the late 1990s, most business records were still maintained in physical form on paper, or less commonly on microfilm. Even documents that originated in electronic form were routinely printed for filing. Now, admittedly, this situation has changed in recent years. Paper records haven't disappeared, but the increased capacity and decreased cost of computer storage have made electronic record keeping practical and commonplace. Most documents originate in paper form, and rather than being printed for filing, they are saved electronically. Many documents are received electronically as email attachments or in other ways. Fewer documents are printed, and paper records are often scanned and saved electronically. And broadband connections have established an infrastructure that gives remote workers online access to digital documents from their homes or other locations. In most organizations, digital documents are saved in electronic folders on shared drives for online access. So with that infrastructure in place, why is an ECM system necessary? Well, shared drives have some significant limitations. In most organizations, shared drives are ungoverned repositories. Individual employees decide how and where digital documents are going to be saved. Few organizations have enterprise-wide rules for naming files and folders or well-defined procedures for the types of documents to be included in specific folders. Many shared drives contain vaguely titled folders and files that were created and saved by former employees, identified only by the employee's name. Within a given shared drives, folders that contain official records may be commingled with work in progress, drafts, superseded documents, duplicate records, personal files, material downloaded from websites, other kinds of unrelated or transitory content. Very little housekeeping is done to remove these obsolete and redundant files and folders in most organizations. This complicates the organization and retrieval of important documents. Shared drives tend to be decentralized repositories. Documents pertaining to a given matter may be scattered in multiple locations, and this dispersal impedes interdepartmental information sharing and promotes duplication of documents. This decentralized approach contrasts very sharply with database management practices, which emphasize the creation of enterprise-wide information resources that are shared by multiple departments. Shared drives provide limited indexing and retrieval functionality. Many documents are saved on a shared drive without metadata other than a file name, which may not accurately represent a document's purpose or contents. To retrieve a given document, an employer must browse through folders and files, which may not be well organized or appropriately labeled to identify their contents. This is particularly difficult when an employee is looking for documents that were filed by others. Complicated directory structures with subfolders nested to multiple levels can be confusing and time-consuming to navigate. The Windows indexing feature can find documents on a shared drive, but it doesn't have the powerful retrieval functionality of an ECM application. Shared drives provide limited safeguards against unauthorized access to documents. Access privileges are defined by individual employees rather than by a central authority as the outcome of a coherent planning process. Even when access to files and folders is limited, documents can be accidentally or intentionally deleted or modified by anyone who has full access to a given folder. So among other limitations, shared drives don't provide effective mechanisms for tracking access to and use of documents. And there's no accountability for unauthorized viewing, printing, downloading, deletion, or modification of records. Shared drives do not maintain an audit trail that identifies employees who have accessed specific folders or files, and they don't track failed access attempts by unauthorized persons. These security lapses are particularly significant for documents that contain trade secrets or proprietary business plans or financial information or other confidential information. And then finally, document storage on shared drives is not compatible with workflow processes in which digital documents are automatically routed among authorized participants in a prescribed sequence for review, comment, signed approval, or other actions. With employees working in multiple locations, automated routing combined with electronic signing is essential to expedite transaction processing and other business operations. The limitations discussed in the preceding slides also apply to the use of shared drives by office-based employees, but some of them can be mitigated in an office context. An office worker, for example, can ask support staff or colleagues for assistance in locating documents that are saved on shared drives. Remote workers, by contrast, have no one conveniently available to ask for help. Remote working is a self-service environment. Similarly, an office worker can physically trace the routing path of a document that's delayed or misplaced in the review and approval cycle, but that can't easily be done by a remote worker. So a well-planned ECM implementation can address these limitations. An ECM application creates and maintains organized, searchable repositories that combine topical folders with in-depth indexing, access mechanisms, and workflow functionality for storage and retrieval of digital content that remote workers need. A properly implemented ECM repository is a managed resource with a defined scope. Unlike a shared drive, it is not an undifferentiated aggregation of electronic content. The documents to be included are determined by policies and procedures. Access to specific digital content is limited to authorized employees on a need-to-know basis as determined by their work responsibilities. An ECM application can track retrieval, viewing, printing, downloading, modification, and replacement of electronic content. And unauthorized access attempts will be monitored. The next group of slides deals with the office space problem that ECM can help us to resolve. So office space is a strategic but expensive organizational asset. Office costs are an important component of an organization's operating costs, but many organizations have a lot of wasted space that's either empty or inefficiently utilized. Pre-pandemic, some organizations had adopted so-called spaceless growth approaches by implementing desk sharing or office hoteling, in which employees don't have any reserved space but have to make a reservation for a desk, or other types of non-territorial workspace policies. The goal of these approaches was to reduce the office footprint, which accords with the lean thinking focus on elimination of waste. Smaller offices have lower utility costs, lower janitorial costs, lower renovation costs, lower equipment and furniture costs, and possibly even lower insurance costs. Organizations typically allocate about 90 to 300 usable square feet per office employee, with more space allocated to executive offices and less to clerical and support staff workstations. The cost of office space depends on a building's location and physical characteristics. So office costs are typically higher in urban business districts than they are in suburban office parks. According to CBRE Research, the leading authority on trends in commercial real estate, the average annual gross rental rate for Class A office space, which is the best space available in a given locality, in major U.S. metropolitan areas was $35.54 per square foot in July 2020. Of course, in New York City, we could expect to spend much more. For $35 a square foot, you're not going to have space in a prime area of Manhattan. You'll have something in one of the far reaches of the Bronx, or maybe Queens or Brooklyn. In New York City or San Francisco, rental rates regularly exceed $80 per square foot per year, and those rates could be even higher in European and Asian locations. The rental costs presented in the preceding slide are just one component of the total cost of office occupancy. Gross rental rates do not usually include utilities, janitorial services, insurance, and other operating costs. When these costs are added, the total cost of occupancy may be 1.5 times the gross rental rate or even higher. So assuming an average space allocation of 125 square feet across all employee classifications, the basic cost of office space at $35 a square foot will be about $4,440 per employee per year. But when the multiplier for total cost of occupancy is added, the average annual cost of office space per employee will exceed $6,200. And for an office with 100 employees, the total cost of occupancy will be $620,000 per year. The calculations presented in the previous slides don't include the cost of pandemic-related modifications that are needed to safely reopen offices. Physical distancing requirements may increase the average space needed per employee by 50% or more. This will raise the average annual cost of office space per returning employee to $9,300 or $930,000 for an office with 100 returning employees. And these estimates don't include the cost of air sanitation improvements, enhanced cleaning services, space reconfiguration, and installation of thermal sensors and other health metric devices. And then also, because of cleanliness concerns, employees who work remotely most of the time but come to the office occasionally may resist desk sharing or other types of non-dedicated workspace arrangements. Depending on the number of employees who return to the office, an organization may need to construct or lease additional space. To avoid these costs, some employees must continue to work remotely, assuming that they are able to do so efficiently and effectively. In this context, an ECM implementation that enables remote workers to complete document-dependent transactions and tasks as reliably and productively as office-based employees is an appropriate business investment. An ECM implementation offers a broad range of functionalities to support remote working. So the next set of slides compares the cost of an ECM implementation to support continuation of remote working to the cost of having remote workers return to the office. The comparison is based on two interrelated approaches to cost justification: cost effectiveness analysis and return on investment, as sometimes described as ROI. The two approaches are sometimes treated as synonymous, but they do have different purposes. Cost effectiveness analysis compares two competing methods of accomplishing a specified objective, usually an existing system and one or more alternatives. The cost-effective method is the one that achieves the specified objective at the lowest cost. Return on investment determines whether a proposed expenditure, which is termed an investment for purposes of analysis, meets an organization's standards for acceptable investments. So we're going to look at these two measures in the next slides. For purposes of cost effectiveness analysis, the objective is accurate, efficient completion of document-dependent transactions and tasks. And in the cost effectiveness analysis, we always compare two methods. So the existing system, method one, is in-office workers using paper files or shared drives. And the proposed alternative, method two, is an ECM implementation for remote workers that allows employees to continue to work remotely. ECM will be considered a cost-effective business investment if the per-user cost of an ECM implementation to support remote workers is lower than the per-employee cost of office space such workers would occupy. This will be developed more fully in the next slide. The actual cost of an ECM implementation can only be determined by obtaining a firm quotation from a qualified supplier, but a range of likely costs can be reasonably estimated. So ECM applications with equivalent functionality are available for either on-premises installation or as a cloud-based subscription service. For purposes of this analysis, it's easier to do it with assuming a cloud-based implementation. So a cloud-based implementation will have typical user costs that range from about $100 to $200 per month per user, or $1,200 to $2,400 per licensed user or employee per year, depending on the product, the number of users in a given installation, the desired features, the amount of document storage required, and some other factors. The annual subscription cost of a 100-user cloud-based ECM implementation will range from about $120,000 to perhaps $240,000 per year. These costs may be increased by upfront expenditures for database setup, user training, and other implementation services that almost all customers require. And these can either be provided by the ECM software developer or more commonly by an authorized reseller or a qualified consultant. So in this example, we use a 1.5 times multiplier to allow for these services, meaning that they'll increase the cost of the implementation by 1.5 times. And this will increase the annual cost estimate to $1,800 to $3,600 per user, or $180,000 to $360,000 for a 100-user implementation. And assuming an average of 125 square feet of space per returning employee across all job categories and no pandemic-related modifications, the total occupancy cost for office space, as we previously discussed, is about $6,200 per employee per year, or $620,000 for a 100-person office. So as these calculations indicate, the cost of an ECM implementation to support remote working will be lower than the cost of office space to accommodate the returning workers. So by that measure, ECM supported remote working as a cost-effective alternative to having employees return to the office. So carrying this analysis further, the return on investment for an in-office versus ECM-supported remote working comparison can be estimated using the accounting rate of return, the so-called ARR, which is an easily calculated ROI measure. It's the first of the ROI measures that we would normally employ to test to see whether an investment is worth pursuing. So the formula for the accounting rate of return is the savings divided by the investment times 100. So our assumptions here are that the investment in an ECM implementation will be $360,000 per year for a 100 user installation. We further assume that the organization will avoid lease payments of $620,000 per year for office space for 100 returning employees if the ECM implementation is put into effect and those employees can continue to work at home. We'll also assume that the organization will incur a penalty of $200,000 for early termination of a lease, which yields a first-year net savings of $420,000. Here's the calculation based on those assumptions. The ARR is calculated by taking $420,000, dividing it, which is the savings, divide by $360,000, the proposed expenditure or investment, multiply times 100. This works out to a accounting rate of return of 117%. So now we need to interpret this. Like other ROI measures, the accounting rate of return is a screening mechanism for acceptable investments. The calculated ARR is compared to a minimum acceptable rate of return, which is defined by an organization's financial officers and investment analysts. The minimum acceptable rate of return is usually based on an organization's cost of capital or its borrowing rate. An ARR of 117% would certainly exceed both of those measures by a very wide margin. And in fact, in this example, the cost savings offered by an ECM-enabled remote working are so great that an organization could pay a lease termination penalty up to $450,000 in the first year and still achieve an accounting rate of return of 20%. Well, these numbers look terrific, but caveats apply to all cost analysis, and this one is no exception. So here are some things to keep in mind. The analysis assumes that remote working is compatible with an organization's strategic objectives and with an employee's duties and responsibilities apart from those for which an ECM implementation is relevant. In other words, the employee must be able to continue working from home and do their jobs apart from anything that the ECM application might support. Second, the analysis assumes that a sufficient number of employees will be required or allowed to work remotely for a long enough period of time to warrant disposing of the office space they would otherwise occupy. Stories have been reported in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other places that this is ongoing now, that some organizations have already disposed of their office space, some in Manhattan, some other locations. So it's assumed that those employees won't be returning. And the third point here is that the analysis assumes that an organization is able to dispose of unneeded office space within a reasonable period of time. This might be possible for office space that's acquired through commercial lease or rental arrangements, but it does not apply to organizations that own the buildings that they occupy, unless they're able to sell those buildings, which would not occur immediately, or have an alternative use for the unneeded space, for example, to house a business operation that currently occupies lease space elsewhere and it could be relocated. Cost avoidance associated with modification of existing space or acquisition of additional space to accommodate physical distancing requirements for returning employees is equally applicable to organizations that own, lease, or rent office space. The analysis further assumes that an ECM implementation will be based on a thorough analysis of user requirements for document indexing, retrieval, viewing, printing, and that remote workers are willing and able to access and use the ECM application efficiently and effectively. And it also assumes that the ECM implementation will provide a managed repository of documents that remote workers need, not cluttered with transitory documents or miscellaneous material and personal items. In other words, that it won't devolve into the same unacceptable situation that a shared drive provides. And if that occurs, an ECM implementation won't offer much of an advantage over access to documents on shared drives. The analysis assumes that an ECM implementation will become fully operational within a reasonable time frame. The anticipated savings won't begin until that occurs. So for rapid implementation, cloud-based ECM application may be preferable to an on-premises installation for organizations that are not currently using ECM. And then this last point is controversial and has not been as widely discussed as it might be. Remote working shifts office costs from an organization to its employees. And while an employer may provide laptop computers or other mobile devices, remote workers are expected to provide heated, lighted, and appropriately furnished office space in their own homes. And they may also be expected to supply their own broadband network connections and internet access. The cost calculations assume that an organization will not compensate its employees for home office space or telecommunication arrangements by paying a portion of their monthly rent or mortgage, or by reimbursing them for office equipment and furniture they purchase, or paying for all or part of their monthly utility bills or internet charges. If an employer does reimburse these costs, and it's entirely possible that labor unions may come to demand it in an environment where remote working is prevalent. Not to put too much of a labor versus capital or Marxist spin on this, but this could occur. If the employer does reimburse these costs, the compensation must be deducted from the anticipated savings. I want to close with one more point. This presentation is concentrated on ECM's role as an enabling technology for remote working in the context of a facilities management plan that reduces office space requirements and costs. But an ECM implementation can be important in other ways. Public health emergencies are not usually cited among information risks because diseases do not destroy or impair the usefulness of information. But the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated its potential to disrupt business continuity. Because ECM facilitates remote working, it should be viewed as a critical component of an organization's emergency preparedness initiatives for future scenarios that may require employees to work remotely.
Right, so I can take a few questions if we have them. I'm not hearing. I don't have any audio. I can't hear. For some reason, my audio is out.
Sorry, my audio was off. Sorry.
Got it. Thanks.
Comment is from Marshall Commons. And he mentions calculation does not take into account the cost to pay for employee internet or phone service, likely an extra 50 to 100 per month.
Yeah, that was mentioned as one of the caveats. You're absolutely correct.
Okay, sorry about that.
Point in the caveats. Yeah.
Any? Okay, hold on, let me add. Here's another comment. Do you see government offices trending in the same way as private industry? This is from Craig Kelso.
Yeah, I think so, but a lot of government offices own their buildings, so they don't have the same kind of flex. You know, this calculation works best if you're in a commercial real estate environment where you could terminate a lease. That's hard for government agencies, but many government agencies are in lease space. So, you know, they'd want to consider the advisability of bringing remote workers back to let them reoccupy lease space as opposed to implementing an ECM. I just think this is a good opportunity for records management to get on board with facilities management. It's something that happened in the early stages of records management. We sort of overlooked that connection, but records management can be a useful facilities management tool. Any others?
Yeah. All right. I think we're good.
All right, so anybody who's got a question can contact me directly at my wsafety@safety.com, and I'll respond to you personally for it.
All right. Hey, thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Bill, for your great presentation.
Thanks for having me.
And we now have a 15-minute break.
Thanks. So we're off now? Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.